That night, the thermometer in Minnesota read 20 degrees below zero. It was a cold that didn't just freeze the skin, it seemed to paralyze the soul itself, and it was exactly on that night that the world decided to close its doors on Clementine. With nowhere to go and expelled from the only place she called home, she found herself alone in a storm no one should have to face. But while the town hid under warm blankets, Clementine found something at the end of the abandoned railroad tracks, an old freight car, rusted and forgotten for decades. Everyone thought that would be the tomb of a poor woman. They couldn't have been more wrong. Clementine didn't just survive, she used her weathered hands to transform that frozen iron into a sanctuary of warmth. And when the worst blizzard of the century hit the town, that forgotten train car became the only light on the horizon, and the place where Clementine would prove that no one is too small to be a hero. Before we continue with Clementine's incredible journey, I want to ask you something. Do you believe that the people the world tries to discard are sometimes the ones with the most to give? If stories of resilience, unexpected heroes, and impossible survival inspire you, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. We share powerful true stories every week about people who refused to give up when everyone else gave up on them. Hit that like button so this story can reach someone who needs to believe in second chances today, because what happened in that frozen train car will restore your faith in the human spirit. Now, let's go back to the moment when everything changed for Clementine. But what no one in the town of Oak Haven knew was that Clementine carried a secret in her soul since childhood. While neighbors watched her carry her single suitcase toward the abandoned tracks, laughing and saying she wouldn't last an hour in that cold, Clementine wasn't walking toward her end. She was walking toward her new beginning. What she found inside that rusted freight car wasn't just a roof. It was something that science can't explain, and that 3 days later would have each one of those people who closed their doors on her desperately knocking on the door of her train car, begging for help. Stay with us, because the story of Clementine and Train Car 402 will change the way you see the people the world tries to throw away. December 23, 2019, Oak Haven, Minnesota. Clementine Hayes stood in the doorway of the house she'd called home for 40 years, watching two men from Greystone Properties load her few belongings onto the snow-covered sidewalk. She was 72 years old, a retired nurse who'd lived alone since her husband Thomas died 8 years ago. They'd never had children. This house, a small 2-bedroom on Maple Street, had been their entire world together. Every room held memories. The kitchen where Thomas had tried to cook her breakfast on anniversaries, always burning the toast. The living room where they'd watched television together every evening. The bedroom where she'd held his hand as cancer took him away. The house had been paid off for 15 years. It should have been hers free and clear until she died. But 3 months ago, everything changed. A man showed up at her door. Richard Hayes, claiming to be Thomas's nephew from a branch of the family Clementine had never heard of. He had papers, lawyer documents, copies of an old will that supposedly proved Thomas's grandfather had left the property in trust, with specific conditions about inheritance. According to Richard's lawyers, Thomas had only had life estate rights to the property. Upon his death, ownership should have reverted to the family trust. But because of confusion in the records and Thomas's long occupancy, the transfer had never been processed, until Richard decided he wanted to cash in. He'd sold the property to Greystone Properties for development. The company planned to tear down this entire block of old houses and build modern condominiums. Clementine had tried to fight it. She'd spent what little savings she had on a lawyer, but the documents seemed legitimate. The courts ruled against her. She had 30 days to vacate. Those 30 days ended today, December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, with the temperature at 20 below zero and dropping. "Ma'am, that's everything," one of the Greystone men said, not meeting her eyes. He looked uncomfortable, as well he should. "You need to surrender the keys now." Clementine pulled the key ring from her coat pocket. 2 keys, front door and back door, on a ring Thomas had given her on their wedding day. Small brass keys that had opened their home for 4 decades. She handed them over without a word. "Do you have somewhere to go?" the man asked, still not looking at her directly. "That's not your concern," Clementine replied quietly. The truth was, she didn't. She'd called every shelter in the county. All were full, with waiting lists weeks long. She'd reached out to the few friends she had left. Most of her generation had died or moved away to be near children in warmer climates. The ones who remained were either in nursing homes themselves or lacked space to take her in. She had $247 in her bank account. Her Social Security check wouldn't come for another week. She had no car, had sold it 2 years ago when she could no longer afford the insurance. She had a suitcase with clothes, a small bag with toiletries and medications, and her purse. That was everything she owned in the world. The Greystone men got in their truck and drove away, leaving Clementine standing on the sidewalk in front of the house that was no longer hers. The cold was immediate and brutal. 20 below zero feels like knives stabbing exposed skin. Within seconds, Clementine's face hurt. Her eyes watered, the tears freezing on her cheeks. Her breath came out as thick white vapor that crystallized in the air. She picked up her suitcase. It was heavy, harder to lift than it used to be, her 72-year-old body not as strong as it once was, and began walking. As she moved down Maple Street, she became aware of faces in windows, neighbors watching. She'd lived on this street for 40 years, had known these people, had been invited to their children's birthday parties, had brought casseroles when they were sick. Not one of them opened a door to offer help. At the Morrison house, the big Victorian on the corner where the family with money lived, she saw them clearly in the front window. Jack Morrison and his wife Beth, along with their adult son and daughter-in-law, all watching her walk past. Jack was holding a phone, clearly taking video. Clementine heard Beth's voice, muffled but audible through the closed window. "Is she really walking in this cold? My God, where does she think she's going?" And Jack's reply, accompanied by laughter, "Crazy old woman probably doesn't even know where she is. Someone should call social services before she freezes to death and creates a problem for the neighborhood." More laughter. Then the curtain closed. Clementine kept walking. At the corner, she had to stop and rest. The suitcase was so heavy, and her hands were already going numb despite her gloves. The cold was worse than she'd anticipated. Much worse. A car slowed beside her, a newer SUV she didn't recognize. The window rolled down partially, and a young woman's voice called out, "Hey, old lady, you need help." Clementine turned hopefully. "Yes, well, you should have thought of that before you got yourself thrown out of your house." The woman laughed. "Seriously, what were you thinking trying to fight Greystone? They own half the county, you never had a chance." The window rolled up and the SUV drove away, the woman still laughing. Clementine stood at the corner, shaking not just from cold, but from the cruelty of it. She'd been a nurse for 45 years. She'd cared for the sick, the dying, the suffering. She'd worked night shifts and double shifts. She'd held the hands of patients who had no family. She'd cleaned wounds and changed bedpans and done all the unglamorous work that kept people alive. And this was how her community treated her in her moment of need. She started walking again, this time with no destination except away. Away from these houses, these people, this street that had stopped feeling like home the moment they'd started watching her suffer like it was entertainment. The town of Oakhaven was small, just over 3,000 residents. If you walked from one end to the other, it took maybe 45 minutes. But in 20 below weather carrying a heavy suitcase, for a 72-year-old woman, it might as well have been 45 miles. Clementine walked through the downtown area, past the closed shops, everything shut early on this brutally cold evening, past the diner where she used to have coffee with Thomas every Saturday morning, past the pharmacy where she picked up her medications. No one was on the streets. Everyone with any sense was inside, warm and safe, except her. Her face had gone numb now. She could no longer feel her nose or cheeks. Her fingers in her gloves felt like frozen sticks. Each breath hurt her lungs. The air was so cold, it felt like inhaling glass. She had to keep moving. If she stopped, if she sat down, she would freeze to death. She knew this from her nursing training. Hypothermia onset was fast in these temperatures. Already she could feel the confusion starting to creep in, the fuzzy thinking that was one of the first signs. She reached the edge of town, where the paved roads gave way to gravel and then to dirt. Out here, past the last houses, was industrial land that had been abandoned years ago. An old grain silo stood empty and dark, some forgotten warehouses with broken windows, and beyond that, the railroad tracks. The tracks had been abandoned when the line was rerouted 20 years ago. They led nowhere now, ending abruptly at what had once been a switching yard, but was now just an overgrown field where nature was slowly reclaiming the industrial space. Clementine had no plan. She was just walking, trying to stay warm through movement, trying not to think about the fact that she might actually die tonight. The wind picked up and Clementine stumbled, nearly falling. The suitcase dropped from her numb hands. She stood there, swaying, looking at it lying in the snow. She couldn't pick it up. Her hands wouldn't work anymore, and that's when she saw it. Through the blowing snow and failing light, Clementine saw a shape in the distance. At first she thought it was a building, some kind of warehouse she'd forgotten existed out here. But as she forced herself to keep walking, leaving the suitcase behind because she couldn't carry it anymore, she realized what she was seeing. A train car, a single freight car, sitting on a section of track that led into the frozen marsh at the very edge of where the town became wilderness. The car was old, she could tell even from a distance, not like the modern freight cars she occasionally saw passing through on active lines. This was from another era entirely, smaller, made of riveted metal that had rusted to a deep orange-brown color. She walked toward it because there was nowhere else to go, because the cold was killing her, and this metal box might provide some shelter from the wind at least. The walk felt endless. Her legs weren't working right anymore. She was stumbling, falling to her knees in the snow, getting back up, falling again. The world had taken on a strange quality. The edges of her vision were darkening. Sounds were muffled. She recognized these symptoms. Moderate hypothermia. She was running out of time. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes, she reached the train car. Up close, it was both worse and better than she'd hoped. Worse because it was clearly derelict, decades of rust, peeling paint revealing more rust beneath. One side partially collapsed where the metal had corroded through. But better because there was a door, and the door was slightly ajar. Clementine pushed on it with her shoulder. At first it didn't budge. Rust and time had frozen it in place. But she pushed again, harder, and it screeched open on protesting hinges, moving just enough for her to squeeze through. Inside, out of the wind, the difference was immediate. Not warm, it was still brutally cold, but without the wind chill, without the constant knife edge of wind slicing through her clothes, it felt almost bearable. Clementine collapsed onto the floor of the train car, gasping for breath that burned her lungs. She lay there, shaking uncontrollably, her body trying desperately to generate heat it no longer had. This is it, she thought. This is where I die. An old train car at the edge of town. They'll find my frozen body here in the spring when the snow melts. But she'd been a nurse for 45 years. She'd seen hundreds of people die, and she'd seen hundreds more survive against impossible odds. She knew that survival was often about small decisions, small actions that added up. Get off the floor. The floor is steel, and steel conducts heat away from your body. You need insulation. Her thoughts were sluggish, hard to hold on to, but that voice, her nurse's training, decades of experience, kept pushing her. Move, move, or die. Clementine forced herself to sit up, to look around. The interior of the train car was dark, lit only by the failing afternoon light coming through the partially open door and a few gaps in the walls. As her eyes adjusted, she could make out more details. The car was maybe 30 feet long and 8 feet wide. The walls were riveted metal, rusted and stained. The floor was steel, covered in decades of dirt, leaves and debris that had blown in through gaps. But there were wooden crates along one wall. Old, rotted, but wood nonetheless. And wood was insulation. Clementine crawled, she couldn't walk anymore, to the nearest crate. It was heavy, but the wood was so old that when she pushed hard it crumbled. She broke off pieces, creating a layer between herself and the steel floor. Better. Marginally better. Her coat was wet from the snow. Wet clothing would kill her faster than the cold alone. She needed to get dry. With shaking hands that barely functioned, she peeled off her wet coat. Underneath, her sweater was damp but not soaked. She left it on. It was better than nothing. She found more pieces of wood and built up a small barrier around herself, creating a tiny space that would trap what little body heat she had. It wasn't enough. She was still losing heat faster than her body could produce it. The shaking was getting worse. Violent tremors that rattled her bones. Sleep would be so easy. Just close her eyes. Let the cold take her. No. Clementine slapped her own face hard. The pain cut through the fog in her brain. Think. You're a nurse. What do people need to survive cold? Shelter. She had that barely. Insulation. She had some. What else? Heat source. There was no heat source. No way to make fire. She had no matches, no lighter. Her purse had been in the suitcase she'd dropped in the snow. But maybe there was something here. This car had been here for decades. Maybe it contained something useful. Clementine forced herself to stand, using the wall for support. She began a systematic search of the car, moving slowly, carefully, because falling unconscious now meant death. More crates, all empty or filled with junk. A corner filled with what might have once been canvas tarps, now rotted to shreds. Metal brackets that might have held cargo. She was about to give up when she noticed something odd about the far wall. The riveting pattern was different, inconsistent. She moved closer, running her hand over the cold metal. There, a seam. Barely visible, hidden by rust and dirt, but definitely a seam. Not just a wall, a panel. Clementine dug her fingernails into the seam, finding a tiny gap. She pulled. Nothing happened. She pulled harder, ignoring the pain in her frozen fingers. Something clicked, and the panel shifted slightly. It was a door, a hidden door in the wall of the train car. Clementine pulled it open, the hinges screaming in protest, and looked into the darkness beyond. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel air moving, slightly warmer air, as if the space behind this panel was insulated somehow. She had no light, no way to see what was in there, but she had no choice either. Clementine crawled through the opening into the darkness, pulled the panel shut behind her, and immediately felt the difference. Warmer. Not warm, but noticeably warmer than the main car. She curled up on the floor of this hidden space, her body still shaking uncontrollably, and waited to see if she would survive the night. The last thing she remembered before unconsciousness took her was a strange thought. This space shouldn't exist. Train cars don't have secret rooms. Where am I? Clementine woke to weak morning light and the realization that she was still alive. She lay perfectly still for a moment, taking inventory. Her body ached everywhere. Her face, hands and feet throbbed with the pins and needles sensation of returning circulation. Every muscle felt bruised, stiff from the violent shivering that had racked her all night. But she was alive. The space she'd found was small, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through gaps in the outer wall, she could see more details. This wasn't just a hollow space. It was a designed compartment. The walls weren't the raw metal of the train car exterior. They were lined with something. Panels of dark wood, aged and cracked but still intact. The floor beneath her wasn't steel but wooden planks, which explained why she'd survived the night. Wood, insulated. Steel would have killed her. Clementine sat up slowly, her body protesting every movement. She was desperately thirsty. Severe dehydration was one of the dangers of extreme cold exposure. And hungry, though the hunger was a distant thing compared to the thirst. She needed water, food, warmth. She needed to figure out where she was and what this place was. The compartment had no windows, but there were small gaps in the walls where the wood had shrunk with age, letting in fingers of daylight. The air quality was better than she'd expected. Clearly this space had ventilation, intentional or otherwise. As her eyes fully adjusted, Clementine noticed more details. This compartment had been finished with care. The wood panels weren't rough lumber, but carefully cut and joined. There were brass fixtures on the walls, hooks maybe for hanging things, and there, in the corner, what looked like a small cabinet built into the wall. She crawled over to it. The cabinet door was stuck, the wood swollen with decades of moisture. She pulled, and it finally gave way with a crack. Inside was darkness, but she could feel objects. She reached in carefully, her fingers closing on something metal and cylindrical. She pulled it out into the light. A lantern, an old oil lantern, brass and glass, the kind that might have been used 100 years ago. Was there oil in it? She shook it gently. Liquid sloshed inside, but she had no way to light it. She needed matches or a lighter, neither of which she had. Clementine continued her inventory of the cabinet. More objects, what felt like folded fabric, heavy and thick. She pulled out an armload and discovered wool blankets, old, musty-smelling but intact, real blankets. Insulation. She wrapped one around herself immediately, and the difference was profound. With actual insulation, her body heat began to build up instead of radiating away. What else was in this cabinet? Her exploring fingers found more items, tin containers that rattled when shaken, a rectangular metal box that felt like a toolbox, and something that made her heart skip, a matchbox. Clementine pulled it out with shaking hands. It was old tin, the kind they didn't make anymore. She opened it carefully. Inside were matches, dozens of them, preserved from moisture by the tin container and the fact that they'd been in a sealed cabinet in a dry compartment. Would they still work? Matches degraded over time, especially in humidity. She had to try. She needed light to explore this space properly, and more importantly, the lantern meant warmth. Clementine struck a match against the side of the tin. Nothing happened. She tried again, pressing harder. On the third try, the match flared to life, a small, guttering flame that seemed impossibly bright in the darkness. She carefully opened the oil lantern and held the match to the wick. It caught immediately, the flame spreading, growing, filling the glass globe with warm yellow light. Light. Real light. Clementine held the lantern up and looked around her shelter for the first time. The compartment was even more remarkable in the light. The wood paneling was walnut, she thought, or maybe mahogany. Expensive wood, carefully finished. The brass fixtures she'd felt in the dark were coat hooks, still solid despite a century of tarnish. But what drew her eye was something she hadn't noticed in the dark. Words carved into one of the wooden panels. She moved closer, holding the lantern up to read, Cornelius Whitmore Personal Car, 1893. Refuge in necessity provision for the lost personal car. This wasn't just a freight car. This had been someone's private railroad car, modified and hidden inside a normal freight car's shell. Cornelius Whitmore. The name was familiar. Clementine searched her memory, and it came to her. Whitmore had been a railroad magnate in the late 1800s, one of the men who'd built the rail lines across Minnesota. She'd read about him in the local historical society's materials years ago, when she'd been researching Oak Haven's history. He'd been famous for his eccentricities. Stories said he trusted no one, carried his wealth with him wherever he traveled, and had various train cars modified with secret compartments. This was one of his cars, hidden, forgotten, left on an abandoned spur where the railroad had once had maintenance yards. Provision for the lost. Clementine turned back to the cabinet and began a more thorough search. Blankets, she'd found those, lantern and matches found, but there was more, much more. Tins of preserved food, canned goods from an era when canning was new technology, sealed in tins that had kept their contents safe for over a century. She opened one carefully. Preserved meat, still edible if not appetizing. More discoveries. A small iron stove, disassembled, stored in pieces. A chimney pipe. A supply of what looked like coal stored in a sealed metal bin. A water filtration system. Primitive by modern standards, but functional. First aid supplies in sealed tins. And more blankets, along with what looked like winter clothing from the 1890s, mothballed and preserved. Cornelius Whitmore had built a survival shelter, a refuge for anyone who found it in desperate need, provision for the lost. He'd left this here deliberately, stocked with supplies, designed to save lives. And it had been waiting, forgotten, for 126 years until Clementine stumbled into it on the coldest night of the year. The discovery of the supplies meant the difference between dying and surviving. But survival required work, constant, exhausting work that pushed Clementine's 72-year-old body to its limits. First priority, heat. The small iron stove, once assembled, was a marvel of compact engineering. Designed to fit into a train car, it stood maybe 2 feet tall with a firebox that opened from the front and a chimney pipe that would vent through the roof. But assembling it was a puzzle. The pieces had been stored disassembled for over a century, and the instructions, if there had ever been any, were long gone. Clementine worked by trial and error, fitting pieces together, taking them apart when they didn't make sense, trying again. Her hands were still clumsy from the cold, her fingers stiff and aching. Every movement was slow, deliberate, difficult. It took her most of the first day to get the stove assembled correctly. Then came the challenge of venting it safely. The train car's roof had several rusted-through spots, which solved one problem. She had places to run the chimney pipe, but she needed to ensure the connection was secure, that carbon monoxide wouldn't leak into her small space. She used strips of metal she cut from the outer car's walls, bending them with tools she found in Whitmore's toolbox, creating a seal around the pipe where it exited through the roof. By the second morning, she had the stove operational. She lit a fire using the coal from Whitmore's stores. The coal was old, but coal didn't degrade like wood. It burned hot and clean, and for the first time since being forced from her home, Clementine felt truly warm. The heat was transformative. Not just physically, though, that was profound. Her body stopped its constant shivering. Her joints loosened. Her thinking became clearer. But psychologically, heat meant hope. Heat meant she could survive here. Heat meant she wasn't going to freeze to death in an abandoned train car. Next priority, water. The snow outside was plentiful, and snow could be melted for water, but she needed containers. In Whitmore's supplies, she found several tin cups and a pot clearly designed for the stove. She packed the pot with clean snow and set it on the stove to melt. The water, once melted and boiled, was safe to drink. Clementine drank deeply, feeling the dehydration of the past 2 days finally easing. Food came next. The preserved tins from the 1890s were a gamble. Canning technology had been new then, and mistakes could be deadly. But Clementine knew from her nursing experience how to check for botulism and other contamination. The tins showed no signs of swelling or rust-through. The seals were intact. She opened one carefully, smelled it, looked at it in the lantern light. Preserved beef, it claimed. It looked grey and unappetizing, but not spoiled. She took a small taste, then a bigger bite. It was edible, barely. Salty and tough, but protein nonetheless. Over the next several days, Clementine fell into a routine. Wake with dawn light filtering through the gaps. Feed the stove, banking the fire carefully to conserve coal. Melt snow for water. Eat a small portion of the preserved food. She needed to ration carefully. She didn't know how long she'd be here. Then work. Always work. She explored the train car more thoroughly, both the hidden compartment and the outer freight section. She found more supplies Whitmore had cached, tools, nails, pieces of metal and wood that could be repurposed. She found books, leather-bound journals where Whitmore had documented his life and philosophy. She read one by lantern light. I have built these refuges as insurance against fate's cruelty. I have seen too many travelers lost to cold, to hunger, to the merciless winter. Each of my personal cars contains provisions sufficient for survival. I leave them in places where they may be found by those in desperate need. If you are reading this, you are such a person. Take what you need. Survive, and if you survive, pay it forward. Help the next lost soul who needs refuge. Clementine read those words and felt tears on her cheeks for the first time since leaving her house. Not tears of despair, but of gratitude. A man who died over a century ago had saved her life. She began improving her shelter. Using tools from Whitmore's supply, she patched gaps in the walls, making the space tighter, warmer. She created a shelf for the food stores, organized the supplies, made the compartment more livable. She even ventured outside briefly during the warmer parts of the day. Warmer being relative, it never got above 0. She needed to retrieve her suitcase, if it was still where she'd dropped it. The walk nearly killed her again. Even with better clothing from Whitmore's stores, the cold was brutal, but she found the suitcase frozen into a snowbank and managed to drag it back to the train car. Inside were her medications, which she desperately needed, clothes, a few personal items, the photograph of Thomas that she'd kept by her bedside for 8 years. She set up the photograph on her makeshift shelf, propping it against the wall where she could see it from her bed of blankets. "I'm still here, Thomas," she said to the photograph. "I'm still fighting." The physical work was exhausting, but it kept her mind from dwelling on the cruelty of her situation. She'd been thrown out of her home in the coldest weather of the year. People had laughed at her suffering. No one had helped. But she was surviving anyway, despite them. Without them, she was proving that she still had value, still had strength, still mattered, even if no one else thought so. 1 week after finding the train car, Clementine stood in the doorway of the outer freight section, looking out at the frozen marsh and the distant lights of Oakhaven. The town that had abandoned her looked small from here, insignificant. She'd survived their cruelty. She'd survived the cold. Whatever came next, she would survive that too. On the 8th day in the train car, Clementine made a discovery that changed everything. She was working on the floor of the hidden compartment, trying to repair a board that had warped and was causing cold air to seep up from below. As she pried up the board, she realized the space beneath wasn't just empty. There was another compartment, a subfloor storage area, hidden beneath the hidden room. Clementine pulled up more boards carefully. Beneath them was a sealed metal box, perhaps 3 feet by 4 feet, taking up a significant portion of the floor space. The box had a latch mechanism, but it wasn't locked, just sealed tight. She worked at it for several minutes before it finally opened with a pneumatic hiss, as if the seal had been airtight for over a century. Inside was a treasure trove. The first thing she saw was paper, documents in protective oilskin wrapping. She lifted them out carefully and unwrapped them. Blueprints, detailed engineering drawings of the train car, showing the hidden compartment, the ventilation system, the stove installation. But these weren't simple drawings. They showed modifications to the structure that shouldn't have been possible with 1890s technology. The insulation system, for instance. The walls of the hidden compartment weren't just wood paneling. According to the blueprints, they contained layers of a material Whitmore had labeled compressed aerogel matrix, a term that wouldn't be coined for another 50 years. The stove venting system used principles of thermodynamics that weren't fully understood until the 1920s. The water filtration system employed materials that looked similar to modern activated charcoal filters. Cornelius Whitmore hadn't just been a railroad magnate. He'd been an inventor, an engineer decades ahead of his time. And he'd built this survival shelter using technology that wouldn't be mainstream for a century. That's why the compartment stayed warm even in extreme cold. That's why the ventilation worked so well. That's why everything in this space seemed to defy expectations. Whitmore had been a genius, creating innovations he'd kept secret, using them in private projects like this. But the documents weren't the only thing in the metal box. Beneath them, Clementine found more supplies. Modern for the 1890s, medical supplies in sealed containers, far better than the basic first aid kit she'd found earlier. Detailed instruction manuals for everything in the compartment, written in Whitmore's precise hand. And at the very bottom of the box, wrapped in layers of protective cloth, she found something that made her gasp. A small metal device, about the size of a deck of cards, with various dials and what looked like a small solar panel on one surface. She unwrapped it carefully and found a note attached. Emergency beacon, future technology. If this shelter is ever found in genuine emergency, activate this device by exposing the solar panel to sunlight for 1 hour. It will transmit a distress signal on multiple frequencies. Rescue will come. I have provided for physical survival in this refuge. But I cannot predict all future emergencies. This device may save lives in circumstances I cannot foresee. Clementine stared at the device. A solar-powered emergency beacon. In 1893, it was impossible. Solar cell technology wasn't developed until the 1950s. Emergency beacons weren't common until the 1970s. Either this note was a hoax, or Cornelius Whitmore had been even more remarkable than history recorded. She turned the device over in her hands. It looked real. Worn with age, but functional looking. The solar panel, if that's what it was, showed no cracks. Should she test it, activate it, and see if it really worked? But what if it did work, and rescue came? She'd be taken back to Oakhaven, back to having nowhere to go, back to being homeless. Here in this train car she had shelter, warmth, supplies. She was surviving on her own terms. Clementine wrapped the device back up and returned it to the metal box. Not yet. She wasn't ready to leave her refuge yet. She continued exploring the compartment over the next days, finding more of Whitmore's innovations. A small library of books on engineering, medicine, survival techniques, all annotated in his handwriting with improvements and observations. A journal where he documented his philosophy. Society discards those it deems no longer useful. The elderly, the sick, the poor. But every human life has value, regardless of what society thinks. I build these refugees as a rebuke to society's cruelty. If even one person survives because of my work, it will have been worthwhile. Clementine read those words and understood. Whitmore had been an outsider too. Wealthy, yes, but not accepted by the society of his time. He'd channeled that rejection into creating something positive, just as she was trying to do now. The train car was no longer just a survival shelter. It was a legacy, Whitmore's legacy, and she was part of it now. Another person he'd saved across the impossible distance of 126 years. On December 28th, 13 days after Clementine had been thrown out of her home, the weather forecast for Minnesota became dire. A massive winter storm was approaching from Canada, bringing with it record-breaking cold and snowfall. The National Weather Service issued warnings. This would be the worst blizzard in 50 years, possibly the worst since the state had been keeping records. Temperature would drop to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind chill would reach -50. Snowfall would be measured in feet, not inches. People were urged to stay indoors, stock up on supplies, and prepare for potential power outages. Clementine heard none of this. She had no radio, no phone, no connection to the outside world. She only knew that the weather was changing, getting colder even than the brutal cold she'd already endured. The wind picked up, howling around the train car with increasing fury. In Oakhaven, people prepared as best they could. Those with generators checked them. Families stocked up on food, water, batteries, candles. The emergency services held a meeting to coordinate response. But the storm came faster and harder than anyone predicted. It hit on the evening of the 28th, and within 2 hours, the power grid failed. Transformers exploded under the strain of the extreme cold. Power lines snapped under the weight of ice and wind. The entire town of Oakhaven went dark. No electricity meant no heat for most homes. Modern houses relied on electric or gas furnaces, both of which needed electricity to run. No heat meant interior temperatures began dropping rapidly toward dangerous levels. Emergency services tried to respond, but the roads became impassable almost immediately. Snowfall was so heavy that visibility dropped to 0. Plows couldn't keep up. Drifts formed 6, 8, 10 feet high in minutes, blocking streets and driveways. People called 911, but emergency vehicles couldn't reach them. The town was paralyzed. In the Morrison house, the big Victorian where Jack and Beth had filmed Clementine walking past 2 weeks ago, the family huddled in the living room as the temperature inside dropped. Their generator had failed after only 2 hours. They'd never properly maintained it, and in the extreme cold, it simply wouldn't start. The fireplace worked, but they had very little firewood. They'd never used it except for decoration. Jack Morrison, wrapped in blankets, tried his phone. No signal. The cell towers were down. He tried the landline. Dead. "We need to get somewhere with heat," Beth said, her voice shaking from cold and fear. The kids, their son and daughter-in-law had brought their children for the holiday. 2 kids, ages 4 and 7. The children were crying, scared by the dark and the cold and their parents' obvious fear. "We can't go anywhere," Jack replied. The cars are buried in snow. Even if we could dig them out, the roads are impassable. Then what do we do? Beth demanded. Jack had no answer. All over Oakhaven, similar scenes played out. Families trapped in increasingly cold houses, elderly residents alone, their temperatures dropping. A young couple whose car had slid off the road on the edge of town, trapped in their vehicle with no way to call for help. By midnight, the situation had become desperate. Interior temperatures in most homes had dropped to the 30s and 40s. People were at serious risk of hypothermia, especially children and the elderly. The emergency coordinator, working by generator power in the municipal building, tried to organize response, but it was hopeless. They couldn't reach people. They couldn't get vehicles through the snow. They had no way to provide heat to 3,000 people simultaneously. Someone suggested the school gym as a warming center, but the school had no power and no backup heat source large enough to warm the building. They were out of options. In the train car at the edge of town, Clementine felt the storm's fury. The wind made the metal structure groan and shake. Snow piled up against the sides, eventually half burying the car. But inside the hidden compartment, with Whitmore's advanced insulation and her iron stove burning steadily, she remained warm and safe. She didn't know that the town was suffering. She had no idea that people were in danger, that children were at risk. She only knew that the storm outside was the worst she'd ever experienced, and she was grateful for the shelter she'd found. On the morning of December 29th, the storm finally began to ease. The wind died down. The snow stopped falling. The sun emerged, weak but present. Clementine opened the door of the train car and looked out at a transformed landscape. Snow drifts 10 feet high. Everything buried. The world completely white and still. And in the distance, the town of Oakhaven. Dark. No lights. No smoke from chimneys. Nothing. Something was wrong. Clementine stood in the doorway of the train car, looking at the silent town in the distance, and understood they had no power, no heat. In these temperatures, that meant people were dying. She thought about the Morrisons who had laughed at her, the young woman in the SUV who had mocked her, all the neighbors who had watched her be thrown out and done nothing. They had shown her no mercy. She owed them nothing, but she'd been a nurse for 45 years. Saving lives wasn't something you did only for people who deserved it. It was something you did because it needed doing. Clementine went back inside the train car and looked at her supplies. She had heat. She had shelter. She had enough space for how many people? She did a quick calculation. The hidden compartment was roughly 48 square feet. The outer freight car section was maybe 200 square feet, though much of it was open to the elements and unusable. If she could get people into the hidden compartment and the more sheltered parts of the freight car, she could probably keep 20 to 25 people alive, maybe more if they packed in tightly. But how would they find her? The train car was half a mile from town, buried in snow invisible from the road. Then she remembered the stove, the chimney pipe venting through the roof. If she fed the fire hot enough, the smoke would be visible for miles. Clementine loaded the stove with coal and wood, opening the vents fully. The fire roared to life and thick smoke began pouring from the chimney pipe. A column of dark smoke rising from the snow-covered marsh, the only sign of warmth and life in the frozen landscape. It took less than an hour for someone to notice. Jack Morrison saw it first. He'd climbed to the second floor of his house, trying to get phone signal, and happened to look out the window toward the marsh where the old railroad tracks ended. Smoke. A steady column of smoke, coming from the direction of the abandoned train car, the one where that old woman had been walking. "Beth!" he called down. "There's smoke out by the old rail yard." "So?" Beth called back, her voice weak from cold. "So there's someone there. Someone with fire, someone with heat." The implication hit them both simultaneously. Heat meant survival. "Can we get there?" Beth asked. "We have to try." They bundled up the children in every piece of warm clothing they had. Jack and his son broke a window in the garage to get to the cars. The door was frozen shut. They spent 30 minutes digging out one SUV, then discovered it wouldn't start. The battery was dead from the cold. The second car, a truck, had a newer battery. It turned over reluctantly, coughing to life. "We'll never make it on the roads," Jack's son said. They're buried. Then we drive across the fields, Jack replied. Follow the railroad tracks. They're elevated, less snow. It was insane. It was dangerous, but staying in the house meant freezing to death. They loaded into the truck, Jack, Beth, their son, daughter-in-law, and 2 grandchildren. 6 people packed into a vehicle meant for 5, heading out into snowdrifts and impossible cold. As they drove slowly, the truck fighting through snow, they saw others. A family emerging from a house, waving desperately. An elderly man stumbling through the snow toward the smoke. They stopped, picked up as many as would fit. When the truck was overloaded, people hung onto the sides, desperate for the chance at warmth. By the time they reached the train car, there were 15 people with the truck, and more arriving on foot following the smoke signal like a beacon. Jack Morrison reached the train car first. He pounded on the door. "Please, we need help. We have children. They're freezing." The door opened and there stood Clementine Hayes, the woman they'd mocked, the woman they'd filmed as entertainment, the woman no one had helped. Jack Morrison stared at her, recognition dawning. You're... "Come inside," Clementine said quietly. "Quickly, before you let the heat out." They filed in, first the children, then the adults, into the outer freight car section, which was much warmer than outside thanks to heat radiating from the hidden compartment. More people arrived, 20, 23, 26. More than Clementine had planned for, but she made it work. She organized them efficiently, her nurses' training taking over. The youngest children and elderly went into the warmest space, the hidden compartment with the stove. Adults took turns in the outer car, rotating through the warm space to prevent hypothermia. She melted snow for water, doled out portions of the preserved food. It fed everyone poorly, but it fed them. She checked each person for frostbite, hypothermia, other cold injuries. The Morrison grandchildren, the 4-year-old and 7-year-old, clung to her. They didn't understand who she was or why their parents looked so ashamed. They only knew she was the nice lady who was keeping them warm. Jack Morrison watched Clementine work, saving his family, saving everyone, and finally found the courage to speak. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for what we did, for filming you, for laughing, for not helping when you needed it." Clementine didn't stop working. She was checking an elderly woman for signs of advanced hypothermia. "Right now, apologies don't matter," she said. "Survival matters. We can talk about the rest later." "But why?" Beth Morrison asked. "Why are you helping us, after how we treated you?" Clementine looked at her then, and her eyes were tired but clear. "Because I was a nurse for 45 years. Because saving lives is what I do. Because children don't deserve to die for their parents' cruelty. But we don't deserve your help," Jack said. "No," Clementine agreed. "You don't. But I'm not doing this because you deserve it. I'm doing it because it needs doing." Over the next 24 hours, as the power slowly came back on in town and roads were cleared enough for rescue vehicles to get through, Clementine kept 26 people alive in train car 402. She worked without rest, monitoring conditions, distributing supplies, keeping everyone calm. When a child cried, she told stories. When adults panicked, she remained steady. She was everything they weren't. Strong, capable, kind, despite having every reason to be cruel. When the rescue vehicles finally arrived, snowmobiles from the county emergency services, everyone in the train car was alive and in good condition. The emergency responders were amazed. "How did you keep this many people warm in these conditions?" Clementine showed them the hidden compartment, the stove, Whitmore's innovations. The responders stood in awe. "This train car saved all your lives," one said. "No," Jack Morrison corrected quietly. "She saved our lives. The train car was just a tool. She's the one who knew how to use it." The aftermath of the blizzard and rescue became a defining moment for Oakhaven. The story spread quickly. An elderly woman thrown out of her home in brutal cold had survived in an abandoned train car, and when the town that had abandoned her faced disaster, she'd saved 26 lives, including 4 children. The shame was palpable. The town council held an emergency meeting. The mayor stood before a packed room and addressed the crowd. "We failed Clementine Hayes," he said bluntly. As a community, we watched her suffer and did nothing. Some of us mocked her. None of us helped. And then she saved our lives anyway. That says more about her character than ours, and we need to do better. The council voted unanimously to establish a committee to investigate the circumstances of Clementine's eviction. What they found was damning. The nephew, Richard Hayes, had indeed been a distant relative, but the will he'd used to claim the property contained irregularities. The courts had rushed the decision, not properly investigating the claims. The property sale to Greystone was reversed. The house on Maple Street was returned to Clementine's ownership, but Clementine surprised everyone by refusing to move back. "I don't want to live somewhere I was thrown out of," she said simply. "That house is full of bad memories now." Instead, she made a different proposal. "I want to keep living in train car 402, she said, "but I want it properly restored and established as a historic site and emergency shelter. Cornelius Whitmore built it as a refuge for people in need. That's what it should remain." The town embraced the idea enthusiastically. Donations poured in, from the people Clementine had saved, from guilty neighbors, from people across the state who'd heard her story. Over the next 6 months, train car 402 underwent careful restoration. Engineers studied Whitmore's innovations, documenting them for historical preservation. The car was weatherproofed, reinforced, and equipped with modern amenities while preserving its historical character. The hidden compartment became a museum exhibit, showcasing Whitmore's genius and his philosophy of helping those in need. But half the train car was kept as a functional living space for Clementine. Modern insulation and heating were added to supplement Whitmore's century-old systems. A small bathroom and kitchen were installed in a separate attached structure designed to blend with the historical car. It became a unique home, part museum, part emergency shelter, part residence. Clementine gave tours to school groups, telling them about Whitmore's inventions and his belief that no one should be left to freeze. She emphasized the importance of helping others, of not judging people as worthless based on age or circumstances. The Maple Street house that had been returned to her, she donated it to a homeless shelter organization with the requirement that it be used to house elderly individuals in need. Jack and Beth Morrison became 2 of Clementine's most dedicated volunteers at the Train Car Museum. They couldn't undo their cruelty, but they could spend the rest of their lives trying to make amends. Their grandchildren, now 9 and 12, visited Clementine regularly, calling her Grandma Clemmy and helping with the museum tours. 1 year after the blizzard, on the anniversary of the rescue, the town held a ceremony at Train Car 402. A plaque was unveiled. Train Car 402, the Whitmore Refuge, built by Cornelius Whitmore, 1893, preserved by Clementine Hayes, 2019-2020. Provision for the lost. In memory of all who find shelter here, Clementine stood beside the plaque, surrounded by the people she'd saved, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, belonging. Not because of where she came from or what she owned, but because of what she'd done, because she'd turned suffering into service, because she'd taken Whitmore's century-old gift and used it to create something new, a legacy of kindness in a town that had forgotten what kindness meant. That evening, after everyone had left, Clementine sat in her home section of the train car, warm and comfortable, looking at the photograph of Thomas. "I made it, Thomas," she said to the photograph. "They tried to throw me away, but I'm still here. And I'm not just surviving. I'm living. I'm helping people. I'm making a difference." Outside, snow began to fall again. Light, gentle flakes this time, not the killing blizzard of a year ago. Inside the train car, the stove burned steadily, its warmth a promise that anyone who needed shelter would find it here. Clementine picked up one of Whitmore's journals and read a passage she'd marked. "I cannot change society's cruelty, but I can provide refuge from it. I cannot make people value the lives of the discarded, but I can ensure some of those lives are saved. That is enough. It has to be enough." Clementine closed the journal and smiled. It was enough, more than enough. She'd been thrown out at 20 degrees below zero, left to die by people who thought she had no value. But she'd found a treasure that was worth more than any house. The ability to save lives, the strength to forgive, and the wisdom to turn someone else's legacy into her own. Train car 402 stood at the edge of Oakhaven, a refuge for the lost, a testament to human resilience and a reminder that the people society discards are often the ones with the most to give. And Clementine Hayes, at 72 years old, was living proof that it's never too late to become a hero. If Clementine's story moved you, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. We share powerful true stories every week about resilience, unexpected heroes, and the strength of the human spirit. Leave a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated or discarded by others? Have you witnessed someone show extraordinary kindness despite having every reason not to? Share your story. Someone reading might need the encouragement today. Clementine Hayes teaches us profound truths about value, forgiveness, and what it really means to be strong. She teaches us that society's judgment doesn't determine our worth. When the world called her worthless, when people laughed at her suffering, she didn't internalize their cruelty. She knew her own value, independent of their opinions. She teaches us that survival requires both preparation and adaptability. Cornelius Whitmore provided the tools, but Clementine had to have the knowledge and determination to use them. The refuge existed for 126 years before she found it, but it couldn't save her without her willingness to work, to learn, to persevere. Most importantly, Clementine teaches us about forgiveness. Not the passive acceptance of cruelty, but the active choice to respond to cruelty with kindness anyway. She didn't help her neighbors because they deserved it. She helped them because children were at risk, because lives mattered, because saving people was the right thing to do regardless of how they'd treated her. That's not weakness. That's strength of a kind most people never achieve. For anyone who's been cast aside, told they're too old, too poor, too insignificant to matter, remember Clementine. Remember that one woman with nothing but her nurse's training and her determination not only survived impossible conditions, but saved an entire community. Remember that the people who laughed at her suffering ended up begging for her help. Remember that she gave it anyway with grace and without gloating. That's power, real power. Not the power to hurt others, but the power to choose kindness when cruelty would be easier. Clementine was thrown out at -20 degrees and told she wouldn't last an hour. A year later, she was a hero, a museum curator, and a living reminder that discarded doesn't mean worthless. It just means undervalued by people who didn't look closely enough. Thank you for joining us for Clementine's incredible journey. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that their value isn't determined by how others treat them. And remember, the coldest night might be the one that leads you to your greatest purpose. We'll see you in the next story.